South Korea's current account has stayed in the black for 8 months straight on the back of strong chip and auto exports. Russia's ambassador to North Korea says whether Pyongyang forges ahead with its 7th nuclear test depends on the U.S. amid Moscow accelerating its ties with the regime. Against this backdrop, Seoul is focusing on its communication with Moscow and Beijing. Voter registration for millions of eligible Korean voters living overseas closes this weekend for April's general election. We take a look at the overseas voter turnout and what's being done to encourage more voters. It's February 7th, 2024. This is Newscenter.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We begin with the latest trade performance. Korea ended the year 2023 with its current account remaining in positive territory on the back of strong exports of cars and chips. Our economics correspondent An Sung-jin explains what this means for the Korean economy.
South Korea's current account balance for December last year saw a surplus yet again on the back of strong exports. According to preliminary data released by the Bank of Korea on Wednesday, the current account saw a monthly surplus for the 8th consecutive month, with the surplus for December standing at $7.41 billion. This is mostly due to improving exports, which grew 5% compared to a year earlier as the value of semiconductor exports jumped. Auto exports also continued their upward trend with an on-year increase of 19.2%. Though exports to EU and China dropped, shipments to US and Southeast Asia were both up.
As demand for electric vehicles dropped, automobile and mechanical product exports to the EU fell. Exports to China declined as manufacturing plants moved to Vietnam. With investment in batteries increasing in the US, exports to the US are expected to rise.
The strong performance of exports and the falling imports led the goods account to also see a surplus of $8 billion in December. The services account, which tracks the inflow and outflow of business services, tourism, and transportation, posted a $2.54 billion deficit due to fewer tourists from Japan. For the year 2023 as a whole, the current account surplus stood at $35.49 billion, nearly $10 billion higher than the year before. The official noted that the positive trend will continue next year.
In 2024, the expected current account surplus is $49 billion, and it is $59 billion in 2025 as the IT industry recovers and maintains its strong performance.
An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
And rebounding chip exports have kept at bay the potential economic repercussions of sluggish domestic consumption. Now, this is according to the Korea Development Institute on this Wednesday in a report that showed overseas semiconductor shipments soared more than 56% on-year last month. In contrast, inflation and interest rates kept a lid on domestic demand for goods and services. The think tank also warned that hostilities in the Middle East remain a high-risk factor, given its possible impact on global oil prices. Battery use for EVs worldwide grew in 2023 despite the recent slowdown in growth of the electric vehicle market. According to market research company S&E Research, the amount of energy held by batteries for EVs registered around the world grew by more than 38%, while the combined market share of South Korea's top 3 battery firms fell in 2023. Overall use of their batteries continued to grow year on year with rising sales of new vehicle models. Notably, LG Energy Solution ranked 3rd overall for annual battery use growth, coming in behind China's CATL and BYD. Now, today we focus on another important issue in the Korean society. The country's chronically low birth rate has been making headlines for quite some time, prompting authorities to come up with more measures. As our Park Gon-woo reports, people have issues of their own when it comes to starting or maintaining a family. Take a look.
South Korea is quickly becoming known for its aging population, with the number of new births recorded on a downward trend. According to data from Statistics Korea, the total fertility rate in 2022 was 0.78. Figures for 2023 are set to be released at the end of February, and experts say that figure could fall even further. But what's behind these dwindling numbers? I went out on the streets of Seoul to find out why people are reluctant to have kids.
The parents usually have some big pressure. Good school, good nursery, good kindergartens, so education fee and the others is really, really expensive.
With higher prices, sufficient earnings are needed to take care of a child.
Housing issues need to be solved and also education fees.
Along with the expense of having kids, some pointed to the difficulty associated with raising children and working at the same time. The importance of alone time by young adults is seen as another factor driving the number of births down. In response, the government introduced several policies this year, including an increase in financial support to encourage people to have more kids. But many young adults I spoke to said they wouldn't think too differently despite strengthening governmental support.
Several policies that can actually help people to settle down are needed more than monetary support.
People also spoke about the need for better conditions for parents returning to work after a child is born. One expert suggested ways to encourage people to have children.
Among OECD nations, Korea is on the upper rankings of working hours, so realistically, parents can't concentrate on raising kids, even if they have them. Working hours need to be shorter.
And he said more companies will need to allow people to use parental leaves more flexibly. With the government's target of raising the total fertility rate to 1 birth per woman, the Presidential Committee on Aging Society and Population Policy also said it will be releasing a comprehensive plan, possibly in March, to solve issues related to the country's low birth and fertility rate. Park Gon-woo, Arirang News.
Russia's ambassador to North Korea says the regime may conduct a 7th nuclear test if provoked by the U.S. Also mentioned was preparations being made for Russian President Vladimir Putin's potential trip to Pyongyang in the near future. Our Kim Jong-sil has this report.
Russia's ambassador to Pyongyang made it clear that any potential conflict on the Korean peninsula will surely depend on the U.S., as North Korea is not seeking a war here. In an interview with Russian news agency TASS on Wednesday, Ambassador Alexander Matsugarov said Pyongyang may decide to conduct a 7th nuclear test if the U.S. continues to, quote, take provocative steps in the region. The Russian envoy recounted North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's remarks at the regime's Supreme People's Assembly meeting back in January.
There is no reason for us to opt for war. Therefore, we have no intention of unilaterally going to war. But if it does become a reality, we will never try to avoid it.
Ambassador Matsugarov added that if U.S. provocations against the North continue, such as, quote, U.S. Air Force strategic bombers continue to fly over the peninsula, the North Korean leadership may as well decide to conduct a new nuclear test for the sake of further strengthening of its defense capabilities. He noted the responsibility for such unwelcome developments will, quote, lie completely with Washington and with Seoul too, even though he admitted that little depends on the South Korean side. Regarding Russian President Vladimir Putin's planned visit to Pyongyang, the envoy said one of the documents to be signed between the leaders of North Korea and Russia was being prepared, adding that it's an agreement on mutual trips by citizens between North Korea and Russia. He did not, however, specify a timeline for Putin's visit. With growing interaction, the New York Times reported on Tuesday that Russia has allowed a partial release of frozen North Korean assets and may be helping Pyongyang with access to Russian banks. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
Now, against this backdrop, South Korea is focusing on communication with Russia and China. Our Pei Eun-ji explains complicated diplomacy surrounding the Korean peninsula.
Almost about a month after South Korea's new foreign minister Cho Tae-il was appointed, he spoke on the phone with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi for the first time. During the 15-minute call on Tuesday evening, Wang invited Cho to visit Beijing to develop bilateral relations further. In response, Cho agreed to schedule a visit via diplomatic channels at a time that's convenient for both sides. The two also agreed on the importance of managing supply chain stability and decided to seek new sources of development through deepening bilateral trade and investment. On North Korea, Cho urged Beijing to play a constructive role in bringing Pyongyang back to dialogue and expressed concerns about North Korean defectors being forcibly sent back to the north by China. Over the weekend, Russia's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Rudenko, visited Seoul. Rudenko met with high-level South Korean officials, including National Security Advisor Chang Ho-jin and First Vice Foreign Minister Kim Hong-kyun. Seoul expressed concerns about Russia's military cooperation with North Korea and called on the two to act responsibly. But at the same time, South Korea and Russia agreed that further communication was needed for both countries' benefit. It's been a while since a Russian official has traveled to South Korea. In fact, it's the first time since President Yoon Suk-yeol took office in May 2022. This recent contact shows both countries' commitment to managing bilateral relations and preventing them from worsening, but challenges still remain. Watchers say the ongoing momentum for dialogue between the two countries is crucial ahead of Vladimir Putin's possible visit to North Korea after the Russian presidential election in March. 배은지, Arirang News.
Details of an arms deal between South Korea and Saudi Arabia that was sealed last November were disclosed earlier this week as the two countries penned a memorandum of understanding to bolster defense partnership on the sidelines of the World Defense Show in Riyadh. Our Lee Eun-hee reports.
South Korea has announced a deal to export to Saudi Arabia 10 M-SAM-2 mid-range surface-to-air missile batteries. According to Seoul's Defense Ministry on Tuesday, the deal, worth some 4.2 trillion Korean won or $3.2 billion was sealed last November between South Korean defense firm LIG Next-1 and the Saudi Arabian Defense Ministry. The M-SAM-2, known locally as Cheonggung-2 missiles, are a core weapon system of Korea air and missile defense. The so-called Korean Patriot uses hit-to-kill missiles capable of intercepting incoming missiles at an altitude of 30 to 40 kilometers. The advanced technology system includes simultaneous engagement of multiple targets, high mobility with canard and side jet thrusters, and direct targeting with a power-enhancing warhead. This is LIG Next-1's second export deal, as it previously signed the deal with the United Arab Emirates in 2022. Tuesday's announcement comes as South Korea and Saudi Arabia have agreed to further strengthen their defense cooperation. As part of this week's visit to the Middle East, South Korea's Defense Minister Shin Won-sik met with Saudi Arabia's Defense Minister on Sunday in Riyadh. The two sides signed the Memorandum of Understanding to establish a joint committee to cooperate in research and weapons development in the mid to long term. On Tuesday, Shin visited Qatar and signed an MOU on furthering the two countries' defense and arms cooperation in light of the 50th anniversary of their diplomatic relations this year. Lee Eun-hee, Arirang News.
A U.S. federal appeals court has ruled that former President Donald Trump does not have immunity from charges that he plotted to overturn his 2020 election defeat. Mr. Trump is likely to appeal the ruling. Chung Eun-ju tells us more about this ruling that came ahead of the November election.
A federal appeals court ruled on Tuesday that former U.S. President Donald Trump is not immune from prosecution for alleged crimes committed during his presidency. A three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit rejected Mr. Trump's claim that he cannot be prosecuted because the allegations relate to his official responsibilities as president. The unanimous panel wrote in a 57-page opinion that it could not accept that former presidents are above the law for all the time thereafter. The court concluded that any executive immunity no longer protects him against this prosecution. The ruling, which Mr. Trump vowed to appeal, rebuffs his attempt to avoid a trial on charges that he undermined American democracy and the transfer of power, even as he consolidates his position as the frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination. Mr. Trump has until Monday to ask the Supreme Court to temporarily block the ruling to delay his case again from heading to trial. A Trump campaign spokesperson said that although there would be an appeal, did not specify whether the full D.C. Circuit Court would be asked to review the ruling or go to the U.S. Supreme Court directly. A spokesperson for Special Counsel Jack Smith, who is leading the prosecution, declined to comment. Donald Trump has made no secret that his overarching legal strategy is to seek delays, because if he were to win the 2024 presidential election in November and the trial had not yet started or had not been completed, he could appoint a loyalist as the attorney general who would drop the charges against him. 정은주, Arirang News.
Now, a little over 60 days remain until the 22nd general election here in South Korea. And for some 2 million Koreans living overseas who are eligible to vote, this week is the last chance to complete voter registration. To talk more about overseas voting, joining me is our National Assembly correspondent, Lee Shi-hoo. Welcome, Shi-hoo.
Hi, Jongmin.
Tell us about the overseas voting process for Koreans living overseas.
Sure. So overseas voting was once a long-anticipated wish for many Koreans living outside of Korea. They actually earned this right back in 2012 after filing a petition to the Constitutional Court. Now, Korean citizens without a permanent address in Korea can vote for proportional representatives in the Assembly. Those with permanent addresses may vote for both proportional and regional lawmakers. They can cast their vote at selected diplomatic offices abroad or alternate locations such as Korean community centers. Eligible voters must register no later than 60 days before the actual voting day here in South Korea. Then the actual voting will open for 6 days, anytime between 14 to 9 days before the voting day.
Right, Shi-hoo, but despite these options, I hear the overseas voter turnout is low. How low?
Right. So in the general and presidential elections since 2012, only about 10% of the total eligible overseas voters registered to vote. Of those, only about 28% actually showed up to vote in past general elections. According to the National Election Commission, overseas voters make up about 5% of the total number of eligible voters. But considering how some lawmakers won by just 0.1 percentage point in the last general election, the voters can certainly sway the election results.
And what exactly is behind the relatively lower turnout?
Well, multiple factors obviously play into this. For one, voting overseas is less convenient than voting in the country, as a political science professor will explain. Listen in.
There are practical constraints in overseas voting. Mail-in voting is not available, and polling stations are far away from where people live. There are also inconveniences in the voting process due to limited space, and also during voter registration. But the main inconvenience is that polling stations are located far away.
Now, despite these obstacles, the NEC is doing a lot to support its voters. Since last October, it's installed an overseas election commission in 178 diplomatic offices around the world. It has also dispatched attachés to help the voting process. One of them is Mr. Kang Ho-sung, working at the Korean Embassy in Washington, D.C. Listen in to what he said.
Currently, we are doing what we can to increase voter registration at each diplomatic office. We are actively promoting overseas voting through local Korean media and Korean communities. The U.S. Embassy in Washington, where I am, is accepting many registrations until the last minute. Registering online is the most convenient method, so we ask those overseas who haven't registered to vote to do so on the NEC website or by other methods by February 10th.
Now, South Korea's NEC has employed a fast and convenient digital process for checking eligibility. It can check whether a person is eligible to vote by a swift scan of the passport and resident registration numbers on its digital data system.
What do lawmakers at the National Assembly say about overseas voters?
Right. So both the rival parties are strongly encouraging overseas Koreans to go out and cast their votes. We had a written interview with lawmaker Kim Seok-ki of the ruling People Power Party, who has the party's Committee for Overseas Koreans. He wrote that every vote matters and that the PPP will continue to lead the improvement of the overseas election system. He also said that the Assembly is discussing many plans for improvement and that the revision of the law to install more polling stations abroad could improve accessibility. Kim highlighted that active participation from these voters would facilitate further related discussions in the future. Now, the main opposition Democratic Party also notes the importance of overseas voters. Let's listen into DP lawmaker Lee Yong-sun, who leads the Democratic Congress of Global Koreans.
Overseas Koreans are the people of South Korea. They have the same sovereignty. It's just that they're simply living in a foreign country. They're important assets of South Korea. And it's not an exaggeration to say that they are public diplomats, very interested in and affectionate towards their homeland.
He also says that it's the Assembly's responsibility to provide the right assistance for willing voters.
In the upcoming important election that will determine the direction of the state, they have much interest in exercising their right to participate. I think as an advanced country, it is our role to make sure they can participate in the upcoming general election.
Both the lawmakers spoke of other methods, such as mail-in ballots, but did say that careful review, discussions, and technological improvements are needed before they can be employed.
All right, thank you for your report today, Shihu.
Thank you.
It was cloudy today and the relatively mild weather continued throughout. The air will gradually become murky from tonight. As smoke from overseas gradually flows in, the concentration of ultrafine dust will increase. By tomorrow, air quality is expected to be bad in the Seoul metropolitan area and the Chungcheongdo province. Please wear a mask on your way to work in these areas. The temperatures have been higher than usual in the morning, but the cold will return at this time of year tomorrow. It will be -3 degrees Celsius in Seoul and -5 in Chuncheon. The daytime temperatures will be about 2 to 3 degrees higher than today, making the daily temperature differences widen a tad. Looking at the morning temperatures, Daejeon will start off at -4, Gwangju and Daegu -2 degrees. Daily highs will move up to 6 in Seoul, 10 in Gyeongju and Busan. There will be no major cold during this Lunar New Year holiday, which is coming up this weekend. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is Newscenter for tonight. Thanks for watching. A panel session up next.